Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. After the second round of China-US economic and trade talks ended, EU countries have been frantically analyzing the recent statements and posts released by China and the US, trying to find clues to determine how the aftermath of China-US interactions will reshape Europe's trade relations with China, as well as the US's trade relations with other countries. A report by the South China Morning Post bluntly pointed out that this has once again made Europe realize that its fate is increasingly influenced by the will of the two major powers, China and the US. The article believes that although the China-US talks in Geneva and London have achieved some phased results, the situation has only been temporarily stabilized, but the EU will still face uncertainty in future trade negotiations with China and the US. The report mentioned that earlier on June 11th, U.S. Treasury Secretary Mafia even hinted that the deadline for reaching an agreement with major trading partners might be extended beyond July 9th, and he specifically named the EU as a sincere negotiating partner. However, just a few hours later, U.S. President Trump publicly said he didn't think there was any need for an extension, and said he was ready to send out official letters to various countries within about a week and a half or 2 weeks, informing them of the terms of the agreement. Trump said, "This letter will tell you, this is the agreement, either you accept it or you give it up, it's up to you." According to a partner at the global consulting firm Albright Stonebridge Group, Wuttke, who served as the chairman of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China for decades, kept his comments measured given Europe's current situation, stating, "Well, I'm not a beneficiary of this conflict. Europe is actually the victim when two elephants trample on global trade." According to the South China Morning Post, timing is absolutely crucial for Europe. Recently, European media reported that the China-EU summit is expected to be held on July 24th. And within the EU, there's a general belief that how the Trump administration adjusts tariff levels after the grace period will have a profound impact on whether the summit can achieve any substantial results. Deborah Elms, Director of Trade Policy at the Singapore-based Heinrich Foundation, said that if the U.S. position changes suddenly as early as July 14th, for example, if they impose a 50% tariff on Europe and a 30% tariff on China, she personally wouldn't be surprised, and by then the situation could indeed be quite different. She said, however, you can't expect things to become any clearer, nor can you assume that the future will be any better. Elms added, "I think this is very difficult for Europeans, but Europe must separate U.S. policy from its own interests." So what exactly is most beneficial for Europe? Among the many trade agreements, the most closely watched issue right now is China's decision in April to impose export controls on several types of medium and heavy rare earths and magnets. According to the South China Morning Post, some EU business groups have said that China has already started issuing licenses, as it is the world's largest producer and processor of rare earths. China has introduced new regulations in accordance with the law, imposing export controls on certain rare earth-related civil aviation products that have both military and civilian uses. While fulfilling its international non-proliferation obligations, it is also safeguarding its own security, which has drawn attention from Europe in recent years. In a recent report, Germany's Der Spiegel described this as a metal crisis similar to the 2022 energy crisis. It also believes that, in the short term, EU representatives have no other choice but to reach a compromise with China. It's worth noting that on several issues where there are differences between China and Europe, China has already shown goodwill towards the EU. For example, on June 10th, the Ministry of Commerce announced that, given the complexity of the current situation, the anti-dumping investigation period for pork and other products originating from Europe would be extended by 6 months, until December 16, 2025. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the EU. According to a Bloomberg report on June 4, European aircraft manufacturer Airbus is expected to sign an order with China as early as next month for several hundred aircraft to commemorate the long-term bilateral cooperation between China and the EU. The size of this order ranges from 200 to 500 aircraft. The order covers various models, including both narrow-body and wide-body aircraft. However, even though there have been media reports that the French industry has already proposed a minimum import price to China in exchange for China lifting its anti-dumping measures, the EU has continued to introduce a series of discriminatory measures against Chinese companies. On June 10, citing the need to protect local industries, the EU announced anti-dumping duties of up to 62.4% on imported Chinese hardwood plywood. On June 2, EU member states voted under the International Procurement Instrument to ban Chinese medical device manufacturers from participating in EU public procurement projects worth over €5 million for the next 5 years. A spokesperson from the Ministry of Commerce pointed out that the EU's decision and related discriminatory measures not only harm the interests of Chinese companies. Moreover, by using unilateral tools, you are undermining fair competition and creating new trade barriers. In fact, the EU has always wanted to leverage its interactions with both the US and China to gain the greatest benefit. For example, the China-EU consultations on electric vehicle price commitments have never reached a consensus, which shows the EU's mentality of wanting to get the most out of the situation. But now, both China and the US have lost their advantageous bargaining chips to play both sides against the EU. To put it simply, when facing the US stirring up a trade war, the best approach for all major economies would have been to unite and resist together, leaving the US aside to rebuild a global free trade system. However, the EU has chosen to be opportunistic and short-sighted, and still can't get over its psychological barrier towards accepting China's rise. On the other hand, since Trump 1.0, the EU started a tariff war with the US and originally signed an investment agreement with China. However, this was overturned by the anti-China European Parliament and never got implemented by the time Biden took office. Then, the EU got stuck in the quagmire of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, causing many countries' economies to regress significantly up to now. What's more, as China and the US face off, the EU is being further marginalized. Not to mention having any real influence in a multipolar world, the EU's impact is even less than that of the global South. After Donald Trump became president of the US, he wielded tariffs like a big stick and disrupted global markets. Although Trump acted tough, it turns out he was just putting on a show. On June 13, The Washington Post quoted Fareed Zakaria, a columnist and CNN anchor. Zakaria published an article in The Washington Post pointing out that Trump has misjudged China's strength and influence. Just like a mafia boss abusing tariffs and other forms of economic hard power, it will only backfire and weaken America's soft power. It shows that the US can't bully a major supply chain country. Zakaria said that although Trump's trade agreement with China this week is vague, it seems to continue his usual timid approach to making deals. Trump's tariffs will bring pain, but of course the pain will be felt by America, not China. Zakaria quoted American economist Dean Baker, saying that the World Bank now expects the U.S. economic growth rate to slow from last year's 2.8% to 1.4% this year, while China's economic growth is expected to remain in line with previous forecasts. To keep it consistent, when it comes to who is actually footing the bill for Trump's tariffs, it's obvious. Zakaria said that behind Trump's series of dramatic performances lies an important lesson. Today's global economy is incredibly complex and highly interdependent. However, this economic interdependence can be weaponized, meaning that countries can use any advantage they hold in the world economy to their benefit. And by doing so, they can exert coercive pressure. Washington has always been one of the most active users of this strategy, imposing secondary sanctions on other countries, punishing individuals, and even excluding certain nations from the global system. In recent decades, both Democratic and Republican administrations in the U.S. have weaponized America's dominant position in global finance. They used tools like the U.S. dollar and the SWIFT financial messaging system to punish Iran. Rivals like Russia and North Korea have been isolated from the global financial system, all without firing a single shot. But now, we're seeing the real limitations of this kind of power and the costs of overusing it. She believes that trade is different from finance. In a multipolar world, countries have many options. Zakaria gave an example. When the U.S. sanctioned exports of moon white pigment to China, the Chinese side could simply use other pigments as substitutes. He pointed out that China also has its own bargaining chips. China is the world's largest exporter of goods, producing nearly 30% of global manufacturing value added, and dominating supply chains in everything from smartphones to solar panels. Zakaria said what's even more important is that China is the global leader in processing key materials. It shows that China refines 68% of the world's nickel, 73% of cobalt, and as much as 99.9% of rare earth elements, as well as 59% of lithium. These materials are crucial for the production of electric vehicles, wind turbines, semiconductors, and even advanced weaponry. Therefore, when China restricts rare earth exports to the US has almost no way to quickly find alternatives. He emphasized that if Trump even had a China strategy, it was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of China. In recent years, China has been working hard to reduce its economic dependence on US imports, trading with other countries, and striving for self-reliance in various fields. Zakaria also mentioned in his article that even before Trump, the US government had already been overusing its economic power for global sanctions. Data shows that in the past 20 years, the number of US sanctions cases against foreign countries has surged fivefold. But Trump took this to a new extreme, threatening to impose tariffs and taking all sorts of measures unrelated to trade, such as revoking foreign students' visas. So how did Trump come across? He didn't really seem like someone representing a world-leading nation, but more like a mafia boss. The article concludes that, at the end of the day, Trump's approach to the trade war is a classic example of abusing hard power. Especially in areas where the US doesn't have a clear advantage, and where coercive tactics might provoke resistance instead of compliance, this approach disrupts global markets, damages America's alliances, and speeds up the international community's search for alternatives to the US-led system. The article argues that Trump's rough use of American hard power comes at the greatest cost to the country's soft power, that is, the international community's trust and confidence in the US. He said it is exactly this kind of trust and confidence that has allowed the US to become the agenda setter and leader of the world, holding a crucial position in many areas such as finance, currency, and international politics.